Well, this one's a bit of a heartbreaker right from the start. We're looking into the murder of Sherry Black.
Yeah, this one's got layers. And what makes it even more unique, more, I guess, direct, is that we're going straight to the source. The interrogation footage of the man who confessed.
Exactly. We're talking years after the crime, hearing it from him, his words, his state of mind. It's a perspective you don't often get in these cases.
A rare glimpse inside, you know?
Yeah,
Trying to understand not just what happened, but why. The why is always the big question, isn't it?
absolutely. And I think that's what draws a lot of us to these kinds of stories. The human element, the darkness that can be hidden just beneath the surface. But before we get to that confession, to those chilling words, we need to set the scene.
Right, gotta go back. Back to November 2010, South Salt Lake, Utah. Picture a quiet community, a place that probably felt, safe.
Peaceful.
Yeah, peaceful, exactly. And in the middle of it, you have this charming bookstore, the kind that feels like a throwback, the scent of old books, countless stories lining the shelves. That was Sherry Black's world.
Her passion.
Yeah.
She poured her heart into that place, built it from the ground up. It's heartbreaking knowing what happens there in her sanctuary.
It really is. And it gets even more, I don't know, I guess ironic is the word, when you realize her bookstore was right next door to her husband's business. Earl, her husband, he ran a billiards hall.
Talk about a study in contrasts. Books and billiards, quiet reflection, and the crack of the cue. It's almost symbolic, isn't it?
Totally. Like these two worlds existing side by side. But then on that day, everything changed. Earl and his employee, Michael, they were coming back from a work trip out of town.
And Sherry's not home.
Right. So they go to the bookstore thinking maybe she's there, but instead, well, they walked into a nightmare.
They found her.
Yeah. I've listened to the 911 call, the panic, the raw terror in Earl's voice. It's difficult to hear, even now.
You can only imagine the shock. To find someone you love like that. And this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. The scene itself, it was horrific.
Brutal. Sherry was found dead on the floor. Evidence pointed towards a pair of scissors as the likely murder weapon just left there. Well, you can imagine the investigators, even seasoned detectives, it's not easy to stomach.
No, it's not. And the brutality of it all, it just amplified the mystery. This wasn't just about taking a life. It felt personal, angry almost.
And there were elements of the crime scene that suggested a possible sexual motive, which, as you can imagine, that added a whole other layer of complexity and horror to an already horrific situation.
Absolutely. So you've got this quiet community, a beloved bookstore owner, and then this brutal, seemingly senseless act of violence. Where do investigators even begin to look for answers?
Well, they start with the basics, processing the scene meticulously, combing for every piece of evidence, fingerprints, anything that could be a lead. They interview Earl and Michael, of course.
Had to be sure.
Oh, absolutely. And their alibis checked out. They had security footage, everything. There was also a book vendor who had stopped by the store earlier that day, also cleared. But as they followed each lead,
Dead ends.
one after another, days turned into weeks, and the case went cold. To make matters worse, there was another murder just a few weeks later. Different MO, different circumstances, but still brutal. Occurred just a couple miles away from Sherry's bookstore.
So now the pressure's really on, the community's on edge, wondering if there's someone dangerous out there.
Right. It's that fear of the unknown. Is it random? Is there a pattern? It gets to people. But through it all, Sherry's family, they never gave up. They kept pushing, kept the case alive, hoping that one day, somehow, there would be answers, justice for Sherry. And it's a testament to their determination to never letting her memory fade that kept the investigation going. But you're right, for years, it was a case stuck in limbo.
Clues, but no clear path.
Exactly. And that's often the reality for investigators. They're left with these pieces, these fragments of information, but no way to put them together. The puzzle's incomplete.
And in Sherry's case, the missing piece, the key to unlocking everything, was actually there all along, hidden in plain sight.
The DNA evidence.
It's almost like a waiting game, isn't it? Knowing that science might hold the answer, but the technology just hasn't caught up yet.
It happens more often than you think, but in the last decade or so, the field of genetics has really exploded, opened up possibilities that investigators could have only dreamed of before.
So we're not just talking about matching DNA to a suspect already in the system. This is something else entirely.
Right. This is about ancestry, about tracing family lines through genetic code, genetic genealogy.
Okay, now you're going to have to break that down for me.
Yeah.
How do you go from a DNA sample to tracking down, a third cousin twice removed? It sounds incredibly complicated.
It is. It's like, imagine digital detective work, but instead of footprints, you're following these genetic breadcrumbs.
Okay, I kind of get it.
Companies like Parabon Nanolabs, they specialize in this sort of forensic genealogy. They take that unknown DNA, like the evidence from Sherry's case, and they compare it to these massive databases of genetic profiles.
Looking for what? A match?
Not a perfect match necessarily, but connections, relatives, even distant ones.
So instead of getting a name, they get a family reunion.
In a way, and that's where the real detective work begins. Genealogists, they take those DNA matches and use them as starting points. They build out family trees, digging through public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, even ancestry websites.
Wow, so it's like piecing together someone's family history based on these tiny little genetic clues. That's got to be painstaking work.
Oh, it is. It's meticulous and time-consuming. But it works. In this case, it led them to Adam Duroro.
So after years, they finally have a name. But that's just the beginning, right?
Absolutely. Detective Pender, who'd taken over the case, he knew that a name on a family tree wasn't enough. He needed solid evidence to connect Adam to the crime. So he flew to California, where Adam's father and grandmother were living.
They had no idea, did they? That their DNA could be the key to cracking this case wide open.
Not a clue, but they cooperated willingly, provided DNA samples. Which, it speaks to that human desire to help, to find answers, even when they don't fully understand how or why.
And those samples, that was the confirmation they needed.
It was. They were able to confirm Adam's identity, his age at the time of the murder, which was 19, and most importantly, his DNA was a match to the evidence found at the scene. It was the break they had been waiting for, the one that had seemed impossible for so long.
It's incredible. It's like something you'd see on TV. A discarded coffee cup, a DNA database, and boom, a decade-old case comes back to life.
It really is. And it highlights how we leave traces of ourselves everywhere we go. In this digital age, our every move can be tracked, recorded, analyzed. For Adam, that trail of information led straight to an interrogation room, face-to-face with Detective Pender.
And that's where we really start to dig into the heart of this story. Years after the crime, after living with this secret, Adam is forced to confront what happened that day in Sherry's bookstore. What's the atmosphere like in that room, in that moment?
Tense, definitely. You can feel the weight of it all, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. But there's also this sense of maybe anticipation, like this case, this open wound, it's finally going to be addressed.
And what about Adam? Is he expecting to be arrested? Does he have any idea what's about to happen?
That's the question, isn't it? And what's so fascinating about this interrogation footage, about being able to see it with our own eyes, is that we become witnesses to those subtle shifts, those cracks in his facade as he grapples with his past.
So let's hit play on that footage and hear what Adam had to say after all these years. It's heavy, isn't it? Just watching him sit there, the way he avoids looking directly at the camera, at us, you can almost feel the weight of it all, the knowledge of what he's about to reveal.
And Detective Pender, he's a pro. He picks up on that vibe right away. Instead of jumping right into the accusations, he lays out the facts, almost calmly. Methodical,
But there's a strategy there, right? It's not just reciting the details. He weaves in things about Adam's past, specific things only they would know. It's like he's saying, we see you, Adam.
Exactly. Like, we know what you've been through. He talks about the foster care system, the instability Adam faced, even mentions a specific incident with a foster father, something that clearly left a mark on him. You can see it even in these grainy interrogation videos. The way Adam reacts, tenses up, his guard starts to drop.
And that's when the confession starts coming out.
Yeah.
Not all at once. More like a trickle at first.
He talks about feeling angry that day, lost. His foster family, they were going on vacation, leaving him behind. He just wandered, ended up at Sherry's bookstore, a place he'd never been before. And, well, that's where things get really disturbing.
The way he describes it, the attack. He grabs a pair of scissors almost without thinking, he says. It's like a switch flipped, a rage he couldn't control.
He talks about stabbing her multiple times, hitting her with a bottle, even trying to cut her throat. The level of violence, it's hard to even comprehend. And yet, at times, Adam's voice, it's flat, distant, like he's describing something that happened to someone else.
And what about the other details, the ones that pointed towards a possible sexual motive? Does he address those?
He dances around it, admits to being curious, to exploring, but never explicitly confesses to sexual assault. And that's part of what makes this whole thing so unsettling, that gap, that gray area where the truth might be hidden, intentionally or not.
So we're left to wonder what really happened in those moments in that bookstore. The full extent of what Adam did, the motives behind it, they remain unclear. But even with those unanswered questions, there's something about Adam's demeanor, something vulnerable that's hard to shake.
He talks about the guilt, the nightmares he's had, how he'd see Sherry's face everywhere on billboards, on the news, a constant reminder of what he did, the life he took, the family he destroyed.
And that's the other layer to this, right? The realization that even someone capable of such violence, of this horrific act, can still feel remorse. It makes you think about those uncomfortable truths about human nature, how good and evil, regret and brutality, they can exist within the same person.
It's complex, and it makes you question everything. That's what makes a case like this so difficult, so hard to turn away from. There are no easy answers, no black and white, just shades of gray.
So where does that leave us?
Yeah.
Adam confessed he's currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In the eyes of the law, justice has been served. But there's still that lingering question. Why? Why Sherry? Why that day?
That's the question that stays with you long after the episode's over. Why? It makes you want to dig deeper, look beyond the headlines to understand what leads a person to this point. And maybe that's the point of these deep dives. It's not about glorifying the crime or sensationalizing the details. It's about confronting those difficult questions, the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that linger long after the credits roll. It forces us to examine our own assumptions, to grapple with the complexities of the human experience, and to try, however imperfectly, to make sense of the senseless.
To find some meaning in the darkness, even if it's just the understanding that there are some things we may never fully comprehend, and that maybe that's okay. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay curious, stay informed, but most importantly, stay safe.